All right. Let me take a second to make sure that we are streaming. Um, so, cool. All right. So, actually, I'm going to check this on my phone real quick because I have the power to do that because we live in the future here. My channel. It says I am streaming. Cool. Hello, me on my phone. Cool. So, hi, everybody. Welcome to the second lecture for Kent State's Games for Education course. Once again, I have labeled this MAGC. It should say AGD for Animation Game Design. So what we're going to talk about today is some theory behind transformational games, and we are going to go over some of the information from the textbook about like types of transformational games. Now, when I say the textbook, I'm referring to Sabrina Kaliba's transformational framework. You'll find that Bogost really came, and oddly enough, I was listening to a podcast yesterday. It's called Game Studies Study Buddies, and if you're interested in game studies and an academic view of games, I highly recommend listening to it. It's really good. But they were talking about how Persuasive Games, the book, really came at a time where it was like this kind of corner that game studies turned that transformed it from like one field into another. I'm not going to go into like the history of that because it's not part of the lecture. But Bogost kind of lays out a set of theories that are picked up widely, like very widely. And he's not the only one. There's other books that do this. Specifically like Mary Flanagan's Critical Play and things like that. But these principles are adopted, and then you start to see this rash of serious and transformational game design. And then Kaliba's book comes kind of like after that really flare up of these things, and after it settles down a little bit. And that is where you get the Kaliba's book kind of looks back at everything that happened during that and said, okay, here are some of the types of transformational games that have appeared. So we're going to look at that listing today so that you can see, and those of you who are watching who are actually in the class, this hopefully helps you think about what kind of transformational game you want to make. Because remember, the class is called Games for Education, but it's not really only for educational games or edutainment games. That's just like a convenient title. Also, my son brought home a cold. It's not COVID. I tested. But so if I'm a little sniffly during the stream, that's what's going on. So I apologize in advance. But let's get going because this is a longer one, and I would recommend definitely maybe approaching it in a few listenings and giving yourself the time to maybe take it in a few bursts. So I'm going to try to get through it as fast as I can, though. It's a big one, though, because there's lots of detail to these types of games. So elements of games, types of transformational games, case study today is Acrasia, which we'll talk about in a bit. Excuse me while I blow my nose. Okay. So first of all, elements of games. Last week we talked about how game elements and rules build game experience. So rules and mechanics. So rules being also I'm in my son's room / my home office. So FYI. Rules and mechanics define what a player can and cannot do. So rules being like the rules in a rule book in a tabletop game, or the code in a digital game, or kind of like the rules, like the boundaries or something, or the actions you can and can't do in like a playground game. And then games have feedback. They provide feedback to the player that signals if the player is doing the right or wrong action, or whether or not that action was meaningful in the game at all. So think about, like, in Super Mario Brothers, if you jump on an enemy, you get points, and the points are represented by a little number that appears above the enemy's head. And it has a pleasant sound, and you bounce a little bit, and that's really cool. So that's feedback. And we use that sort of input feedback loop to signal to our players what are the right and wrong things to do in our game. And that's a language that we can start to build that reinforces what we want players to do in our game. And when we're creating games that have meaning, the meaning is reinforced through these elements. So what are some other elements of games? Well, today we want to carry on that discussion that we've been having by looking at how rules and feedback become game systems. So from Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman in their book, Rules of Play, systems occur when objects interact with one another in an environment based on their attributes to create internal relationships. So I've highlighted some words: objects, environment, attributes, and internal relationships. So let's look at what this means. That's kind of, again, a bit theory-based, but let's look at what this means, like, in a game environment. So here's the Unity interface, something that you may be very familiar with. So objects are game objects themselves. The models, sprites, sound effects, assets, and prefabricated objects that you make in other programs and bring into, like, in this case, Unity. So, like, the stuff we make that goes into the game engine itself, and then that we turn into, like, interactive things. Our environment is our scene. It's a level, the program, whatever interactive space, and I'm using space as a broad term, not like to mean architectural space or like level designers specifically or something like that, but any kind of, like, the game interface or the game itself is an environment in which objects do stuff and are placed and do stuff, and our attributes are components of our objects that we add to our objects to make them interactive. So when you bring in a 3D model to Unity or a sprite, you put attributes, you put components in, that's what it's called in Unity specifically, onto them. And that gives them collision or behavior or physics, or like, makes them controllable and things like that. So what attributes do is they are the things that make the object interactive itself. And when you have a bunch of these interactive things in a level, in an interface, in a game, in just kind of a simulation environment, they all sort of kludge together, and then something happens. It may be chaos, because you just kind of, like, put a bunch of oh my gosh, what's the physics type where rigid bodies or something, where they just kind of go, or maybe you've carefully crafted the way that they interact, and from those interactions, meaning happens. Now, the meaning might be, yo, cool video game. It could be fun multiplayer experience. Or, again, it could be artistically meaningful, a discussion of the, abstraction of the world. So these are the elements that help us, like, build what we're doing. So, and I'm going to make myself smaller so that you can read. Boop. So when we look at systems, we're looking at a few different types of systems potentially. One is formal systems. Um, you know, systems defined by like the actual stuff in the computer. But then we also, we're very interested in this class in the cultural system, a system defined by how the game or the thing, the work, interacts with other contexts such as society, language, history, things like that. Now, you may be like, well, that seems kind of weird and academic, and I'm never going to think about games in that way. But think about this. You know, as my kids are watching the Sonic the Hedgehog 2 movie with Jim Carrey and Idris Elba as Knuckles, my 6-year-old can play with her Among Us Poppet, and my 3-year-old can play with his Super Mario action figure. And my 8-year-old can be reading up on Stardew Valley strategies in the Fangamer Stardew Valley guide. So games have made a business out of the cultural system. There is the commercial aspects of like cultural systems. Many of you have maybe been to fan conventions or watched streamers or YouTubers or influencers online do stuff with games. So those are cultural interactions, even if they're not like, what does Sonic 2 say about society? Kind of things. But, we can make games that are specifically beyond their marketing meant to engage with aspects of our culture. So let's look at how chess interacts. Oh, gotta sneeze. Sorry about that. So we can look at how chess... hold on. We can look at how chess, interacts as these different kinds of systems. So, what are the objects in chess? So the objects in chess, the formal system of chess, has like the objects of the pieces. Those pieces themselves have attributes. They're different moves. The environment of chess is the board of chess, and the board dictates movement in different ways. And then the internal relationships are what happens when somebody plays chess and like the game that emerges that from that. And when I say the game, I don't mean like just the abstract notion of the game of chess. I mean like, when Garry Kasparov played so-and-so in, blah, blah, blah. Those kind of, like, the thing that happened that one time, game of chess. Those are, like, the internal relationships start to create, memorable instances because, we in game design, we call that emergence. So, when you have a system and the system goes, i.e. when the game is played, something unpredictable will probably happen, and the player will find that interesting, and that is emergence. So that kind of like openness is something you want to like try to build into your games, all games, because that makes your games more fun and engaging. But let's look at like the cultural system of chess. Cultural systems look more at the place where games that they have in the world around them. If we zoom out from parts of chess's game design and look at chess as an object itself that exists in a culture, things take on a very different meaning, but one that can give us a lot of opportunity as game designers. So chess itself, in this idea, it's the object itself. Now, there are many different ways of looking at games. One way is to look at games as whole objects. There's, when you're making games, we tend to look at them as collections of objects because it's like I made a 3D model. The 3D model itself is a project, but then it goes into a larger thing called a game. These are kind of modes you can switch between when you think about games. But for right now, let's think of like chess, the game, right? So attributes of chess might be its history, how it went from an Indian military simulation to spread to the rest of the world. We might look at cultural context of historic chess matches, such as what it meant for the development of AI when Garry Kasparov lost to IBM's Deep Blue. So that has a lot to do with chess, because chess was the contest between this human and this computer, but it has bigger cultural meanings. The environment is very different when you kind of put it in the context of human versus computer. And then chess's internal relationships are, then occur within culture itself. Chess is a cultural reference that most people will understand even if they don't know how to play chess. And then showing two characters playing chess or a chess-like game, as we saw in something like, Kingdom Hearts 3, is going to send specific signals about maybe the intelligence of these characters, or the nature of their interactions. Like it's friendly insofar as they're playing a game, but maybe they're friendly but mortal rivals. There's a if you put a chess game in a film, it's going to have signals, and we care less about the act of putting it in the film, but more about like, hey, isn't it interesting that chess can be this like signifier? Let's also talk about interactivity itself. Systems play out in the context of interactivity, which correlates with the ideas of rules and feedback that we discussed. So interactivity is an active relationship between two, and I edited in or more things. So we think about different types of interactivity here. Cognitive interactivity, which is the relationship occurring at the mental level. So like when you're playing a video game, what are you thinking about? Functional interactivity, practical relationship at a physical level. So, me with a game controller, this is the functional interactivity. So like if the buttons are sticky on this, again, because like my 3-year-old's been playing it or something, that's going to impact my notion of its functional interactivity. Explicit interactivity, that is the user interacting with design decisions we as designers make. So, when we choose to make something move at a certain speed or jump a certain amount of height, that's explicit interactivity. We are setting those things for the player to interact with and what happens when that happens. This is often what you're talking about when we talk about play testing is, we make a design decision, we take it to a convention, or we have somebody sit down with it and we test whether or not that was a good thing or a good choice or a bad choice, by testing, the validity of our explicit interactivity that we're setting up. And then there's beyond the object interactivity, which I am seeing is cut off by my little frame of myself here. So when an object affects the world around it, cultural influence. Again, Sonic 2 movie, Among Us Poppet, bands that string quartets that play Zelda music, game that teaches kids about the Oregon Trail. That's beyond the object interactivity. So let's use another game most people have heard of as an example, Pac-Man. Imagine yourself at an arcade in the 1980s deciding which game to play. Your journey of interaction might look like this. You see ads. You have seen ads, the graphics on the cabinet or other objects on screen, and start to interpret the symbols. They're brightly colored, appealing, and different from games around it. So later when you play, this process continues. You're interpreting audio-visual aspects of the game cognitively, internally. That's cognitive interactivity. So let's say you decide to play. You put your quarter into Pac-Man. You move the joystick to move Pac-Man through the maze. You might even grab the side or change your stance to balance yourself as you drive the character through the maze, which is actually a thing that was pointed out, people did this while playing Pac-Man. There's a really great article by historian Kat Despira about this thing of like grabbing the Pac-Man cabinet, because she noticed a bunch of old Pac-Man cabinets had wear and tear on that part where people would grab it. So that was a thing people would do. But that's functional interactivity. You're grabbing the physical object. You are, of course, playing a video game that was made by a person named Toru Iwatani. Iwatani made decisions about how the maze was laid out, how Pac-Man moved, how often fruit appears, what the dots and power pellets do, and how the ghosts chase the player. When you play, you're interacting with the decisions and the challenge or experience of the game, and the challenging experience is because of these design decisions made by the designer. Lastly, when you leave the arcade, you might talk to your friends about playing Pac-Man and compare scores. You might buy a Pac-Man shirt or hear the song Pac-Man Fever by the band Buckner and Garcia on the radio because it's 1981. Years later, you might open Google years later when Google is a thing and see that the Dazed Doodle is an interactive Pac-Man game. The game had, and there's your cultural impact. Real quick. Last, we look at design here for this part of the lecture. Design is the process by which a designer creates a context to be encountered by a participant from which meaning occurs. It's a creative process. It is not, you'll hear this one thrown around a lot. Oh, I'm designing. And when they say, when they say I'm designing, but they're like maybe manipulating Unity, but they're doing it in kind of like a utilitarian fashion, not like in a thoughtful fashion. More like, I have learned to press the buttons, therefore I am designing. A lot of people think like mere software usage is design. That's not true. Design is a mental creative process that happens through software and other tools, but it is not, the mere act of operating the software. Think about the difference between like an architect and somebody who is a CAD operator. An architect is going to make design decisions and may draw their design decisions of like how big a room should be, where walls should be placed in AutoCAD or Revit, as the case may be. But a CAD operator is going to basically just sort of like take what the architect has specified and create CAD drawings, but they're not putting any decision making or input into what they're drawing. So design they are not designing. The architect is designing. So that distinction is really important because, when we make these things, this is why for the project element of this course, I don't let you talk about the software right away in terms of what you want to build, because I want you to focus on the design and not just the buttons to be pressed, the asset packs to be downloaded, the graphical rendering parts of the game. That's unimportant to these other things that are cultural and interactive and things like that. So another list of fading in things. Let's say you have a game designer. They make games for players. So there's your designer, and they're making games for players. The players are the participants. The context that the designer makes for them is the game itself, and that is the designed object. And then lastly, the meaning is what happens when the player plays the game. Maybe you're showing a parent or grandparent the project you've worked on. Maybe your transformational game actually succeeds in its mission. So you might recognize this picture from the Canvas page. That's actually my daughter when she was younger playing a transformational game at the Smithsonian American Art Museum arcade. I noticed the game, like, it's a physical object that's used to interact with a digital game. So, again, don't don't just limit yourself to traditional board or video games. You can be kind of off the wall with things. Maybe the person playing just really likes your game and it puts a big smile on your face on their face. That's meaning. That's probably one of my favorite things about doing this is that like you make people happy. So it's really cool to see the joy on somebody's face when like they experience something you built. So these are things that is the meaning that we create as designers. Okay, here we go. So let's quickly go through types of transformational games. Design basics out of the way. Let's talk about like types. Part of the word soup, but here's how we synthesize the previous slides into the approach these games have into like the types of transformational games. The purpose of a slide like this is to show how games and design decisions go beyond placing objects within a 3D interface, but that every decision you make shapes the user's experience. In this type of game making, that's massively important to understand since our goal is for the player to have been impacted by our game. So, we pay close attention to how functional and explicit elements, objects, attributes, environments, shape beyond the object's interactions, relationships, culture, people, and create meaning. That is the stuff we're bringing together to create transformational games. There we go. All right, cool. I didn't skip. So these are things I want you to think about as we look at these transformational game genres. How game systems and design decisions affect the player and space around the game itself. Now, while I do this, by the way, not all games fit neatly into only one genre. They may have elements of multiple. So you just be forewarned. Real quick. So the first type of game we are going to look at is seen in the course title, which is educational games. So these are kind of like a pretty good baseline for understanding this type of game design. Often these games are for kids, but age appropriateness is more or less based on how complex the subject matter being learned is. This game, Immune Defense by Molecular Jig, teaches players how the immune system works by putting you in charge of cells fighting off invading pathogens in a real-time strategy game. It's a pretty intense game. It's not just for kids, but I've seen lots of kids play and enjoy this game. This game was developed by real biologists to educate kids on very complex topics using a very complex game genre. But because of how they managed the challenge, it actually works. It's a really good game, and it's always really popular when I see it at shows. Again, not all of these are digital. Evolution is a game that was pitched to game publisher North Star Games by an educator wanting to teach kids about evolution. In this game, you have to manage creatures and add traits to them so they can survive from round to round in ever-changing environments. A similar game that's perhaps a bit more famous, the North Star folks won't like me saying that, but is Wingspan. Again, very similar thing, created by a biologist, I don't know if it's actually a biologist in that case, but basically a person that wanted to educate people about birds. But, these exist in the tabletop space too. Then you have serious games. Now, every time I say game made for non-entertainment purposes, I get yelled at by my colleagues out in the world because they're like, no, it's not just for entertainment. It can be entertaining. When I talk about serious games, I tend to talk about a particular style of game, often for government or like things that are kind of like really, really, really in the training or simulation space. I used to work in environments where like you kind of weren't supposed to talk about games. I didn't listen to it. But I once worked for a director that was like, we don't say game around here. We don't say video game around here. And, okay, dude, chill out. But some people get really hung up on that. I don't think they're right, but that's their thing. So this is why I like the alternate term transformational game, because I think it casts a wider net. I think I do want you to understand that this is a widespread term that can be used, that some people use to talk about this whole genre of transformational games. So just be aware, and this is why I kind of like go back and forth in class. That's actually on purpose, so you hear both and are familiar with both. But when we're talking about serious games, when I talk about serious games, I tend to talk about very particular genre, which, to me, address their topic areas in like really straightforward terms. These are often like training simulations for government, medical, different types of things. So in last week's lecture, you saw a training simulation game about patient management in hospitals. It had a literal hospital room, a literal patient, simulated equipment, so on. This game, Cyber Threat Defender, by Hazardous Software, is a strategy game that helps companies visualize potential threats to their internet security using real data. The game is presented with cool graphics, but is overall pretty straightforward. Now, as Chris Hazard from Hazardous Software can tell you, studies have shown that games used specifically in training like this and like the patient simulator can be more effective if you recreate the setting and situations very straightforwardly, very literally, than say like putting a layer of fantasy on this. So, if you put cybersecurity, if it was a cybersecurity game, but you're like, ooh, the wizard lord is invading with his magic, then the cybersecurity people are not necessarily going to get it, because maybe they're not used to like interpreting that fantasy. So that's the kind of thing that like, that's why I really kind of put these in their own bucket as serious games, because they tend to be like really fact data driven with not a lot of like fantasy. And when I say fantasy, I don't mean like orcs and goblins and elves. I mean like, a setting, a fictional setting. So try to think in terms of how cognitive interaction becomes interpretation, becomes real world effects. That's like really straightforward in these games. So that's what we're going to approach as serious games. And then similar to this is training simulations, games that let you perform simulated real world tasks as a training exercise. So again, very similar to what we're looking at as serious games. So again, here's virtual patient management. This is an example where serious games, isn't a genre. This game is better described as a training simulation, even though I mentioned it on the serious game slide. I know that can be confusing. So where like the cybersecurity defense is kind of like an abstracted version, this is less abstracted. So like this is a serious game, but not a training simulation, because you are not doing the internet security stuff. You're not doing IT stuff. You are seeing an abstracted version where it's like, the nodes are lighting up red and stuff like that, and you have to like click buttons, but you're not doing the full like installing of internet software and things like that. This one is almost one-to-one, so like it's a simulated patient, you have a text box, but like you might be working with the like a simulation of the actual equipment. So that's what I mean by like super hardcore training simulation. So it's a serious game, but it's also a training simulation because it's closer to the actual activity. A serious game can be kind of an abstracted version of the activity to like get the idea of that activity across. Behavior change games. I know I'm going kind of quick, but I'm trying not to make this like a too long video. Behavior change games. So games designed to change behaviors, often in health related or security fields. So again, the cybersecurity defense would be a behavior change game because it's like, hey, stop clicking on the sketchy emails, right? That's part of the game. So this is an example of where, like, again, these genres can be fluid and a game can fit into more than one genre. So keep that in mind when you do this. It's the same thing like any video game genre. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which you may or may not have played, but it was like a bit Zelda, a bit Metroid, and then it had RPG elements. And then that became the Metroidvania genre. But like at the time, it was like, what even is this? What? So, that's like games can often mix and match genres, and then that becomes a new genre. Think of like action adventure, but like super duper hard, Soulsborne's, and then like gothic-ish Soulsborne, right? So that's how genres evolve. So that's kind of what these are. It's like you have a bit of everything sometimes crossing over. So in these games made by some former students of mine, they were trying to create games to assist people on parole in their parole processes. So basically reducing the chances that they will offend again and then go back to prison by teaching them good habits to keep them on a good path. So that was the goal of the game. The game sent the players on quests, but the quests were real world quests like making a resume or avoiding alcohol for a specific period of time, which you'd accomplish in the real world and check into the app. So it's a gamification app, but that's kind of what the thing called for. We'll talk about gamification later. Long story short for you right now, it's something that I don't love all the time when it's overused or talked about as some kind of like magic balm to fix the world. I think that's ridiculous. But I do think that like it can be a tool in your toolbox for when needed. Just make sure you like put some stuff around it, which we made sure these have cool stuff beyond just the gamified part. I know you might be thinking, what is he even talking about? We'll get there, don't worry. But then the app gave the players in-game character experience points, which could be used to advance the game story. So again, there was like something else going on than just like do a thing, get a cookie, do a thing, get a cookie, do a thing, get a cookie. That's you want to avoid that kind of game design. That's gamification. So you want to put something else, a story, mini quests, some other activity that makes the game interesting and a place that you'd want to spend time. But yeah, so these were, these were they were behavior change games. So games for health, somewhat related are games for health, which usually takes the form of games where, again, players practice good habits. Where these differ from behavior change games or serious games is that the games are usually a blend of behavior change and education for things like taking medication or learning about treatments. So Remission, for example, is a game that teaches players about cancer treatments and how they hunt down and eliminate cancer cells. So this is a very video gamey game that is this kind of like, action adventure title about how, your treatment works. So it educates people on how, on what's going on in their bodies as they go through this treatment. Next are games that affect positive social change, which are usually called impact games or social good games or games for change. There is a whole conference called Games for Change. It's part of the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City. So that's a place to potentially submit your games to if you make a social good game. So these are games whose mechanics are used to have players interact with a real-world issue from the point of view of a person affected by the issue. So sometimes, if you can't tell, these games can be kind of like, again, dark or serious or not always fun or interesting, in a normal gamer way, video game enthusiast way. But here's a game called Pre-Shave by Sam Pavlin. Now, it's a funny game. It's a comedy game where you use two difficult to control arms. So think Bennett Foddy's Get Over It or his previous game Quap. Each arm is controlled by a separate mouse. So these are it's a comedy game in that you're trying to perform this thing with really awkward controls. Again, Get Over It. But you're trying to shave the hair from your body, within a time limit. But the message here, the serious element, is that after you do this main gameplay thing where you're trying to shave, you find out that you're trying to do it under a time limit because you're trying to get to the airport on time. And the thing in the game is that you are a Middle Eastern person preparing to go to the airport. You win the game by shaving enough to not be randomly selected for additional search by the TSA. The developer wanted people not like him to know what it was like for him to go to the airport, and did so in a fun, challenging, and thoughtful way that's entertaining but really impactful. Real quick. I really hate online lecturing during allergy season. Another game, Black Room by Cassie McQuater, is a surreal and meditative game experience that uses sprites from popular video games to challenge how women are depicted in those classic games. The repurposing of famous game sprites and the way in which they are arranged makes the player think about the topic as they see elements placed together in new ways. So definitely go check out this game. It's kind of hard to describe. But it's really, I don't like to use this term a lot, but it does use web browser interfaces in a really cool, innovative way. And it's really neat. But then it has these elements that challenges, again, gender-based depictions in video games, which are really powerful. So again, and this is a multi-award-winning IGF finalist kind of game. And then there's empathy games. So these games can also share the social good games. They can also share a lot in common with empathy games, which are games designed to create an emotional response as a way to have players share a small part of another person's personal experience. So I've mentioned iThrive a few times already in this course. Their worksheets are part of your syllabus material. One of their big projects is the Critical Strengths Engine, which is a tabletop role-playing game system that emphasizes emotional development of characters over physical development. So when you play the game, you're leveling up, kind of emotional strengths. Trying to find some of the emotional integrity instead of things like strength and dexterity. It's designed to have players experience emotionally uplifting and meaningful adventures in exciting fantasy worlds that resemble the worlds of other games. So, you're in the same type of space, but you're encountering challenges focused less on let's slay this dragon and more on interacting with the people in the world and the team and things like that. This is actually becoming kind of a popular subgenre. Trying to see if I have, a friend of mine who's a game developer in Cleveland. They have their own studio up there. Created a similar game called Tea Time Adventures where it is the same sort of thing, but you're, kind of getting together and having more of these like cozy mystery style adventures in a LGBTQ friendly sort of environment, built on this kind of emotional strength and things like that. So these kind of games can be really important and impactful, but also again, look like games, play like games, be fun, and be a good way to get together with friends. Another is Depression Quest, which we saw in the first lecture. This game is a choose-your-own-adventure style game made in the Twine engine about the experience of living with depression. Like many adventure games, Depression Quest presents you with choices of how to proceed, but blocks off healthy choices as a way to demonstrate how depression affects your decision-making capabilities. Now, this game has been criticized for not being like always the most accurate or always the most equitable. I want to bring that up because Depression Quest may not match everybody's experience, but this was the developers' experience. So I just wanted to make sure I acknowledged that some folks have spoken up and said like, hey, that's not quite how I experienced it. What's going on? But coupled with really excellent and evocative writing, this is a quick but highly meaningful and personal game. Personal gain. So our case study game for this week is Acrasia by Doris Rush from her time at the Gambit Game Lab, which is a game lab in Singapore associated with MIT. Well, I think one is in Singapore, but then one is at MIT. So I've included some links from the game's website here. I may have to check to make sure that the links still work. Again, with some of these other older games, if they're Flash-based, then, poof. But unlike transformational games that emphasize a right behavior, this game allows players to explore the rules of the system and make their own decisions on what is right or the right way to proceed for them. So the game is one about dealing with drug addiction, and upon the beginning of the game, the player must collect pills, eliminating the decision to only play by avoiding the drugs. You fail if you don't take any pills. But beyond that, the way the game proceeds is up to the player and can result in multiple endings or interpretations. To enter the game, the player has to collect a pill-shaped object and thus enters the game as an addict. You can't not take a drug in the game. But how you balance the psychedelic state is important to like how the game pans out. Then there's a game type called citizen science or crowdsourcing. Now, this is like the last one we're going to cover, but on the transformational game list are these types of games. They're games that use network features to have players solve large-scale problems together. So what this means is this is kind of using the power of communities, again, crowdsourcing, to accomplish goals. So, you'll hear something of like crowdsourcing, like, oh, I'm going to do a Kickstarter campaign, I'm going to crowdsource the money, meaning that you're going to get like lots of little donations from, lots of individual donors, and that's going to help you raise capital instead of trying to go to like one investment firm and then raise capital or get a singular loan or something like that. But, not to go into like the history of these, but some of these are based on like studies of game communities in commercial games that like will band together and accomplish things. And sometimes you'll see events in commercial games now about these sorts of things. But one famous example is this game Fold It by the University of Washington Center for Game Science. In this game, players encounter a protein strain and have to unfold them. So if you play this, you are given a protein strain, you have to unfold it. But you have to unfold it using the actual like methodologies that scientists use to unfold proteins. Now, why do you do this? This allows scientists to make advances in medical research, specifically for cancer treatments. The game was created because there were issues too complex for single people or small teams of scientists to solve themselves. So the problems were made into a game and then released to the public. So instead of, it's not that like you are going to try to solve the entire problem. You're going to unfold part of something, and then like everybody else unfolds part of something. And then what that's going to do is basically put the process in front of hundreds, thousands of people. And then that allows the scientists to kind of like get the benefit of working with a huge number of people, doing like small, understandable parts of the task. And then, this has actually resulted in several medical advances. Real quick. All right. Another was a game called Investigate Your MP's Expenses. Very catchy title. By The Guardian. So this game was a response to a scandal years and years ago about members of the British Parliament charging personal expenses to their government accounts. When the Guardian newspaper asked for expense reports from Parliament, this is over in the UK in case you haven't picked that up, the paper was given kind of like a go bleep yourself box, unorganized tens of thousands of paper documents. So the Guardian newspaper people digitized the documents and turned to their readers, creating a game where players could gain points by reviewing documents and reporting irregular spending. So basically, the staff at the Guardian didn't do it themselves. They digitized the documents and then turned it into an online game where you kind of like get points for reviewing documents. So it was, and again, using the power of like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people, people signed on to the website and played the game and loved it and got to see what their members of parliament were up to. So that was a big success and, resulted in some disciplinary action for a lot of people. The very last thing I want to mention is that while not all games, and I alluded to this in some of our discussions last week or this week, depending on when you're seeing this, the very last thing I want to mention is that while not all games are made to address real-world issues, some entertainment-focused games have been repurposed for transformational purposes. Your textbook, the Kaliba book, designates these as intentionally designed and adapted transformational games. What we've been looking at throughout this lecture are genres. So the intentionally designed are ones that are specifically meant to be transformational games. Adapted are the commercial games. My note is a little funky there, but for clarity, intentionally designed, like I am making this game and it is going to be a transformational game. Adapted is I'm making this AAA game. Oh, a history teacher in Saskatchewan used it as a text for their history class. Who would have thunk? Wow, that's adapted. So it's not only AAA, it can be anything, but like, the ones that get big news are like either massive indie games that are usually then just by that time bought up by somebody like, a Minecraft kind of thing, or you get like, Assassin's Creed. So what we've been looking at throughout this lecture are genres of intentionally designed transformational games. But I wanted to give a few examples of cases where commercial games were adapted for transformational use. And this is actually a big topic in education, is like teaching with games. I have a few books like specifically on how to teach with specific games. So again, the most famous instance is the Assassin's Creed series. Each game of which features a setting, a different historical setting. These games make liberal use of historically relevant people, places, and artworks. So history teachers have included the games in their classes. And this is not like slapdash done, like, oh man, wouldn't it be cool to kill the Pope or something, which you do in these games, but it's not like Ubisoft hires historians to help them build these things. That's really important to note. They'll like bring in a person and contract with them for and like, you know, academic folks, like people teaching at universities. But they will bring in academics to actually help do this work. And they go for Odyssey, like they went to Greece. Like I saw a GDC world building talk on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and it was basically like what we did on our summer vacation in Greece. But I mean, it was like enormously impactful because they were collecting information and data and things like that. But at one presentation during the DGRA, Digital Games Research Association conference in 2013, I even saw a talk where Assassin's Creed 2 was the textbook for a Renaissance history class. So this is becoming more and more widespread. And the story of Assassin's Creed in history classes, of course, has a twist ending. In 2017, Ubisoft Montreal, the studio that makes Assassin's Creed, themselves added an educational mode called the Discovery Tour to Assassin's Creed Origins, which had an ancient Egyptian setting. Players explore the environment and are given access to writings, photographs, maps, and other resources to educate about ancient Egyptian culture. And then finally, another game that's been repurposed for educational use, I've mentioned this, is Minecraft. The game has been used for things such as recreating historical computer systems or acting as a medium for people to research and build ancient structures. There have also been examples of the game used as a way to lead neighborhood revitalization projects. Urban planners have used Minecraft to recreate a neighborhood in Minecraft and ask residents to build the types of changes they would like to see in their environment. So, in summary, we looked at the different types of systems and interactivity and how they lay the groundwork for, like, I guess, getting players to the point, like, these are the tools cognitively, but also, like, within the game making process that we are using to make meaning in our games, and how do we introduce that meaning to players? How do they interact with games in such a way that they encounter this meaning? And then what are the different types of games in this genre? And this is really important because I want you to think deeply about the types of games you're going to be making. It's not just let's teach math or let's teach grammar. And I'm not saying those are bad types of educational or transformational games. I'm just saying that's one type. I would love to see people really take some time to think deeply about the types of problems they want to solve and the types of things they want to do, and come up with some really cool and groundbreaking stuff. So that's it for this week. Your goal for the next week is to join a team. So you want to go to the Discord for your campus, and once you've all posted your pitches, your game pitches, we can also use the in-person part of the class to accomplish this as well. But I basically want you all to network together and introduce yourself, your name obviously, and your skill set, and you're each going to form a team. Don't feel like you need to only be on the game that you pitched. You can abandon the game that you pitched. And if somebody does say, I want to be on the game that you pitched, you can let your pitch go. That's totally acceptable too. This is kind of how we form teams at game jams. But we'll form teams, and then that'll be who we're working together with on the paper and on the game that will result from the paper. So once you have your team assembled, email me by next week's class, next week's in-person meeting for the class, your group list, and it has to be, I'm looking for team numbers of 4 or 5. I know it says no more than 4 here on this old slide, but 4 or 5. That way you have enough for like a coder, an artist, a sound designer, and a programmer, or not a programmer, that's 2 programmers. That's nice. But, programmer, artist, sound designer, producer. So spreadsheet paladin. But what you're going to be doing is you'll email me with the list of people in the group, first and last names. So like when there's, it's Dave. It's like, well, there's 7 Daves. Which Dave? So please make sure first and last name. So ask each other your first and last names. So there we go. That's it. I will talk to you later, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you again soon. Bye.